Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of our lesson on civil rights today. This is our very last video lesson for RPS at home this year, and while I'm sad it is over, I want to congratulate you all on making it through these past few months. It is certainly strange, unprecedented times that we live in, but Ms. Howard and I are so glad we could be with you and support you virtually. Just as a final reminder, I'm Ms. Green, and that's Ms. Howard. You heard from her in part 1 of this lesson about civil rights. We are both Albert Hill history and social science teachers, so go Tigers, but also go RPS. As always, we love all of you RPS students. Before we get into our final lesson, let's check in together. I know things have been really tough lately. So are you feeling okay? Do you need to drink some water or eat something before you're ready to start learning? How's your learning environment? Is it too loud? Do you need to move someplace quieter so you can hear? Do you need to get headphones to plug in? And what about your mental health? Again, I know that this has been rough for everyone, especially for our Black community members. So are you doing okay? Are you mentally prepared to put your thinking cap on, or would tomorrow be better? If you're having a tough time right now, just remember that you are awesome and we love you. So let's take one last deep breath together. So we're going to breathe in, hold it, let it go. Okay, ready to go? So let's quickly remind ourselves of our goal for this lesson. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify and explain examples of current civil rights issues and create a solution in writing. So we're really going to be putting it all together today, using what you've learned throughout the year, both at school and with us at home, to make a final culminating product. We hope that you'll be able to think about all the pieces we've touched on, from uncovering fake news and bias to thinking like an economist, to the 3 branches of government, to federalism, to civic virtues, to really produce a quality product. So for this lesson, you're going to need something to write with, something to write on, and your brain power as always. If you need to gather any of these items, go ahead and pause the video now, and then you can rejoin us when you have them. Okay, all set? So here's our agenda today. So first, we are going to do a super quick review of your mission from part 1. Then we're going to go through our guided practice, in which I'm going to walk you through an example of a civil rights issue, discussing what it is, a little bit about its history, how it impacts Americans now, and what's being done to try to improve it or fix it. That's going to then prepare us for you to receive your final mission. And then lastly, we will close out for the year with an image. Ready? Okay, let's do it. Okay, so in part 1, Ms. Howard asked you to review a web page and learn a little bit about some civil rights issues today. In case you didn't catch part 1 of our video lesson, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what civil rights are. When we say civil rights, we are not just talking about the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, as you can see displayed here in some of these images on the screen. Of course, civil rights issues today are in many ways connected to this movement, especially the way that people raise awareness and try to fight these issues. But segregation and racial inequality are just 2 examples of civil rights issues. Rather, when we say civil rights, we're talking about past and present issues. There are still major inequality issues in our nation today. I'm sure that you all are aware of what has been going on since the killing of George Floyd on May 25th by a Minneapolis police officer. And I'm sure that you are aware and maybe share in the outrage that's sparked by this, as well as the murder of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and many, many other Black Americans. And I'm sure you've heard and seen the thousands of protests taking place across the nation. You may have even participated in some of them yourself here in Richmond. These events truly demonstrate just how many civil rights are still being denied to Americans, and especially Black and Brown Americans, through racial injustice and police brutality. I know you don't need me to tell you that. But for today, I want you to recall now what issues you identified for your mission. It's likely that racial injustice and police brutality have been weighing heavily on your mind, and that's okay. We can use our outrage and we can channel it with our mission at the end of this video. But for some of you, you may have decided to reflect on a different issue that you read on the webpage, or maybe that you just know to be true in your own life or the life of others in your communities. And that's okay as well. Maybe you've been thinking about women's issues or LGBTQ issues or discrimination in places like the workforce, meaning at your job, or maybe when trying to find a house or to rent an apartment. Maybe you identified some civil rights issues in education or related to healthcare access or even access to high-speed internet. Maybe you were really inspired by Ms. Howard's criminal justice reform example, or maybe you took it a step further to think about drug laws and the racial inequality that this can lead to. I want you to go ahead and have whatever issue you're interested in investigating further identified now. If you need to pause the video and think about it or go back and revisit the article from your mission, you can pause the video and do that. Otherwise, keep that issue in the back of your mind, or even better, jot it down on your paper. You're going to revisit this at the end of the video and you're going to use it in your mission. So let's go ahead and get started now with our guided practice. So for our guided practice, we're going to walk through another example of a civil rights issue. I'm going to explain what it is. We're going to learn a little bit about its historical significance, and then we're going to discuss why it's an issue today. And then finally, we'll talk about what we can do to change it and what is being done to change it. This is exactly what you're going to be doing in your mission with the civil rights issue that you choose. So as we move through our guided practice, I encourage you to take notes. So if you ever feel like I'm going too fast and you pause the video, feel free to do that. But this is going to model exactly what you'll be doing later on. So the civil rights issue that I'm going to use for our example today is voting rights, and specifically voter suppression. Okay, so you may be thinking, what is voter suppression? Let's talk about what that word suppression means first. Suppression is deterring or keeping someone from doing something. So voter suppression then is behaviors or actions that deter people from voting. And the reason that this is a big issue is that it generally impacts certain groups of people. For example, low income and ethnic and racial minority groups. So when we think about voting rights and keeping people from voting, of course we know that there are many groups who have been historically denied the right to vote. They include Black Americans, women, Indigenous or Native people, and people younger than 18 who of course still do not have the right to vote. But this is actually not what we're talking about here. Of course those were big problems and may still be, but it's important to understand that that's not exactly what we're talking about here. When we're talking about voter suppression, we're talking about individuals and groups of people that are systematically meaning that because of the way things are set up in the government and or related to elections in our country, we're talking about people that are systematically deprived of the ability to vote, even though they have the right to vote. So we're talking about people who are allowed to vote, but don't or can't for reasons related to laws, regulations, or other systems that are put in place and institutionalized within our nation. So let's watch a video that explains a little bit more about voter suppression. This video is going to help us learn about some of the history of voter suppression and some current reasons why it's a problem today. So as you watch, I want you to keep these questions in mind, and you're going to write down answers to these two questions. So the first, what are some historical examples of voter suppression that are raised in the video? And two, what are some current examples of voter suppression raised in the video? Okay, you ready? Let's watch the video.
To be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street.
Your orders to disperse, that march will not continue.
15th Amendment made it clear that you couldn't deny somebody the right to vote based on their race, color, and previous condition of servitude. However, it didn't ensure the right to vote for all citizens. There were ways to keep people from participating in the democracy, and there's a number of different ways, all of them just insidious. But probably the most insidious of all of these was the grandfather clause. And the grandfather clause stipulated that regardless of one's race, irrespective of one's previous condition of servitude, everybody is allowed to vote, of course, as long as their grandfather voted. This worked out well for certain demographics and for people who were previously enslaved. Their grandparents didn't vote, their grandfather didn't vote. So that's a problem. The future problem, or the ensuing problem, would be that if I don't vote, that means that my grandkids can't vote. And so there's never going to be a time that we'd be allowed to vote. The other part is violence. And this started fairly early after the 15th Amendment. You saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee, which spread throughout the South. But they weren't alone. They had other groups called the Red Shirts that would show up to the polls with red slashes across their chest, literally intimidating these voters. And so that was some things that you saw.
Wave of new laws making it tougher than ever just to cast a ballot.
17 states will have new voting regulations in place for the presidential election this November.
About 10% of registered voters don't have the right kind of ID.
Voting rights serve as the conduit through which all other change is made possible. You cannot tackle economic insecurity. You cannot fight for better climate change legislation. You cannot protect access to criminal justice reform. The things we want to see made real become so because of voting.
Voter suppression is sort of a political tactic or technique to try to keep voters away that you think won't support you. Almost all of these efforts have been designed to sort of keep poor people or people of color who historically vote overwhelmingly Democratic from voting. How can you sort of combat voter suppression? Well, we live in a moment in time where in democratic states like California, we're trying to make it as easy as possible to vote.
So young people have to make it their business to go en masse to the voting booths. Youth will be the deciding factor of this upcoming presidential election in 2020. There is no doubt about it.
Okay, so let's pause the video now, our video now, and make sure that you've jotted down an answer or two to these two questions. If you need to go back and rewatch any parts of it, feel free to do so. So take about 2 minutes to finalize your responses and pause in 3, 2, 1. Okay, you have some answers? So let's talk about now the history of voter suppression. What are some historical examples? Well, from the video, we learned that a lot of this stems from Jim Crow laws after the ratification of the 15th Amendment. So this is mainly an issue for racial minorities, most notably Black Americans, and it all stems back to slavery. One way that Black voters were suppressed were through literacy tests. You'd have to be able to read a passage or sign your name or take a test in order to vote. Well, it was illegal to teach enslaved people how to read or write, so this ended up making it extremely difficult for many Black voters who couldn't read or write. There were also voter ID laws, and Black voters were much less likely than white voters to have proper identification. And there were poll taxes, meaning you had to pay a fee in order to vote. This obviously suppressed anyone who was poor, but it disproportionately affected Black voters who often had nothing as a result of slavery. If you were enslaved, you had no property of your own, and you didn't receive money for your work. Another example that the video points out is the grandfather clause. This stated that if your grandfather voted, then you were allowed to vote. But if you didn't, then you couldn't vote either. Of course, right around the time of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, many Black Americans' grandfathers were enslaved, so of course their grandfathers couldn't vote. So then they couldn't vote. You see that the issue that this presents for Black Americans, as well as other racial minorities at the time, that certainly were much less affected by this issue than white Americans. The video also talked about Black voters being kept away from the polls due to the threat of violence and intimidation efforts from groups like the KKK and the Red Shirts. If someone thought that voting might mean getting lynched, they probably weren't going to do it, and that was a real threat for Black voters at the time. Sadly, the KKK is still an organization that exists today, and it's just another reason why the civil rights movement didn't end with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So that brings us to, what does voter suppression look like today? We no longer have the grandfather clause, poll taxes, literacy tests, or the fear of violence, although maybe there is some intimidation going on today, as the video pointed out. But we don't have these same things keeping people from exercising their right to vote. So why is voter suppression still an issue? Well, voters are still systematically oppressed even today. One way that voters are kept from voting is through voter ID laws. Those are still an issue today, as they were back then. Different states have different laws about what kind of ID you need to bring with you when you go vote. Some states require photo IDs, like a driver's license or a passport, whereas other states are less strict and will accept just a birth certificate or something like that. The idea behind photo IDs is to reduce voter fraud. And voter fraud is very rare. But the downside of requiring photo IDs is that it has a much bigger impact on low-income voters, many of whom are ethnic minorities. It also unfairly impacts the elderly and people with disabilities. Getting a photo ID costs money, and it can be a hassle. You have to go to the DMV, you have to wait in line, you have to pay a fee. It can be too expensive and take too long for many people, or be too difficult to get to the DMV. Does that mean that those people shouldn't be able to vote? That's something that you might want to think about. Another way voters are suppressed today is by closing or changing polling places. Around the nation, polling places, which is the place that you go to vote, are being shut down or they're being moved to different locations. The idea behind that is to save money because election processes are so costly, so you're trying to eliminate some cost there. But what it can end up doing is lowering voter turnout, meaning lowering the number of people who actually go vote by creating longer lines and thus longer wait times on election day at polling places. And it adds distance to your commute to the polls. This makes it harder for people to get to their polling places and results in people not being able to vote either because they don't have the time or they don't have an easy way to get there. This is also a big issue because it affects low-income areas with large racial and ethnic minority populations more than it affects high-income, mostly white neighborhoods. Because the people living in high-income neighborhoods, they're more likely to put up a fight and resist these changes and closures, which means that their polling places are usually left alone, whereas low-income neighborhood polling places are closed or changed locations. Additionally, voters are suppressed when early voting periods are shortened. Early voting periods are days or weeks leading up to Election Day in which voters can either mail in their ballots or go in person to vote before Election Day. The idea behind eliminating or shortening these periods is that it saves money on political campaigning. Candidates have to push really hard during that voting period to get out the vote and get people to vote for them. And that means that they have to spend more and more money the longer that early voting period lasts. But when you eliminate or shorten early voting, you run into similar problems as closing or changing polling places. If more people have to vote on Election Day, there will be longer lines at the polls. If people have to wait a long time, they might not be able to vote at all. Additionally, some people don't have time to vote on Election Day, regardless of how long the lines are. I mean, it is a work day and a school day, of course. The other real kicker here is that, according to the ACLU, Black voters are more likely than white voters to vote early. So by eliminating or shortening early voting, states are exacerbating or worsening this tension, this racial inequality. The last example we're going to touch on today is related to felon voting rights. In many states, if someone is charged with committing a felony, they lose their right to vote entirely, meaning that even when they're released from prison, they aren't allowed to vote. The idea is that people who commit felonies have broken the social contract with the nation, and thus they give up their right to have a say in society, and that knowing that this is a consequence of criminal activity might deter people from engaging in it. But as we know from Ms. Howard's lesson, this is a major civil rights issue because racial minorities, but more specifically Black men, are way more likely to be charged with a crime, either a misdemeanor or a felony, than white people. So that means that Black people are significantly more likely to lose their right to vote than other races. This is actually changing in many places around the nation, including Virginia. Before leaving office in 2017, Virginia former Governor Terry McAuliffe, he restored voting rights to over 200,000 formerly incarcerated people. So these were just 4 examples of voter suppression today: strict voter ID laws, closing or changing polling places, eliminating or shortening early voting periods, and denying ex-felons the right to vote. But there are many, many more. If you're interested in seeing some more examples, you can check out the link in the learning plan for day 4, which has a link to an article with 61 examples of modern voter suppression. I encourage you to check it out on your own. But this brings us to our last point. which is what are people doing about voter suppression? What are individuals, organizations, and governments doing to make a difference? One thing that individuals are doing is to encourage more people to vote. Is that they're hosting voter registration drives to make sure that people don't miss registration deadlines and that they know about upcoming elections, and also informing people about their polling places and early voting rules and regulations and how to do it. As we stated before, within the government, governors are using their executive authority to restore voting rights to individuals who were released from prison after committing a felony. And organizations like the ACLU are using the judicial system to fight voter suppression, such as challenging laws that eliminate early voting or close polls. There are tons of other ways that individuals, organizations, and the government can get involved to help solve this civil rights issue. And I encourage you to do some research and brainstorming on your own. But our next steps are for you to replicate this process that we just went through of identifying and explaining a different civil rights issue and formulating some solutions in your mission. So let's talk about that now, starting with why we're even doing this. So why are we talking about this stuff? How does it apply to us? This stuff is particularly important at this moment in time because it's become exceedingly clear just how much racial inequality and injustice still exists in our nation. A big current that runs through many of these issues is race. These issues are made worse because the inequality and injustice disproportionately affects minorities. Something has to be done to make our nation more equal, safer, and overall a better place to live for people of color. So let's do that. With our mission, you're going to identify a current civil rights issue. You're going to explain why this issue is a matter of civil rights. You're going to create a solution to help solve the issue and increase fairness and equality for all. Although this is our last video, Ms. Howard and I still want to see your work, so we can give you a shout out on Twitter. So for this final week, shout outs are going to go out to Joshua Spadadi and Cameron T. Remember that you can follow us on Twitter at RPS Civics at Home, or you can email us at cgreen8@rvaschools.net. Before we end, I want us to examine this picture together from the Washington Post and just to think about, bring it all together, bring it home. What does this image say about the civil rights movement? Let's reflect and observe for a moment. This image very clearly reminds us that the fight for civil rights has not ended. We can see the fight still today in the protests going on around the country. It's unfair that we even have to point out that Black Lives Matter today, but we do. We don't yet live in a world that's fair and equitable. But if we do our part to identify the unfairness and the inequities, and then actually step up and do something about it, then our nation has a fighting chance to become a better place for everyone, where all voices are heard, loved, and protected equally. I want to end this with you all on an uplifting note by thanking you. It's been such a pleasure to be able to teach you all during this time of uncertainty. If you've learned anything from Ms. Howard and me, I hope it's that you are powerful, you can take action, and you can make a change. You have the tools to do it, so do the good work in our communities locally, statewide, and nationally. Thank you all and have a safe and happy summer.